Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once said Joe Biden was part of the mishpacha, using the Yiddish word for family, to which President Biden responded saying, quote, "It's true that Prime Minister Bibi and I go back a long way." Clearly that bond is strained as the rift between the two leaders is now wider than ever. Netanyahu has scrapped an Israeli delegation visit to Washington this week. The visit was aimed at getting the prime minister to consider alternatives to a ground invasion in Rafah. Now the suspension of the meeting has put a new obstacle in Washington's way, and the U.S. has called Israel's decision both surprising and unfortunate.
So it is a bit surprising and unfortunate that they're not going to apparently attend these meetings because, as you heard the secretary say in Tel Aviv on Friday after he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other members of the Israeli government, we believe that, number one, a full-scale invasion of Rafah would be a mistake. It would be a mistake not just because of the civilian harm that it would cause, which would be immense.
Now, the Israeli Prime Minister's abrupt decision came after the U.S. abstained in a UN Security Council vote that demanded an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the release of all hostages. The resolution was introduced by the 10 non-permanent members of the body.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/254 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstention. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2728, 2024.
Now, Washington's decision to abstain has clearly set off sparks with its closest ally in the region. Now, Netanyahu said the failure of the U.S. to veto the resolution was a clear retreat from its previous position and would hurt Israel's war efforts. The White House, however, said that the U.S. vote at the UN Security Council does not, in fact, represent a shift in policy.
Our vote does not, I repeat, does not represent a shift in our policy. We've been very clear, we've been very consistent in our support for a ceasefire as part of a hostage deal. That's how the hostage deal is structured, and the resolution acknowledges the ongoing talks. We wanted to get to a place where we could support this resolution, but because the final text does not have key language that we think is essential, such as condemning Hamas, we couldn't support it. Though, because it does fairly reflect our view that a ceasefire and the release of hostages come together, we abstained.
Still, Washington has been averse to the phrase immediate ceasefire earlier. It had even vetoed previous resolutions calling for the same. However, as famine looms in Gaza, there's been growing global pressure for a truce in the war.
Why has the administration blocked so many pretty similar resolutions in the past?
Because they didn't condemn Hamas. I've said that repeatedly.
This one doesn't condemn Hamas either.
Because they didn't condemn Hamas, and because they also just called for a ceasefire with no linkage to the hostages. This one, the reason why we can't support it but didn't veto it is because it does link hostages and a ceasefire, which is in keeping with our policy.
Now, in February, the United States moved the resolution at the UN Security Council, but did not call for an immediate ceasefire. In fact, that resolution instead mentioned a temporary ceasefire as soon as practical. Since the war began, the U.S. has vetoed 3 draft resolutions, 2 of which demanded an immediate ceasefire. In fact, just last month, Washington vetoed an Arab resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire. And earlier, the U.S. was also adverse to using the word ceasefire and vetoed measures calling for it. Just last week, for the first time in 6 months of the war, however, Washington proposed a resolution seeking immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza. This resolution was vetoed, however, by Russia and China, but it marked a further toughening of Washington's stance toward Israel. For months now, in fact, Israel has been defying Washington's call for restraint in Gaza, which has led to a public pressure campaign by President Biden. And now earlier this month in an interview, President Biden said that Netanyahu was hurting Israel more than helping it. He also reportedly issued a National Security Council memo suggesting that military aid to Israel should be conditioned on the delivery of humanitarian aid. Now, President Biden has also issued sanctions on Israeli settlers as well. And the U.S. president running for re-election in November is facing mounting pressure from both allies and Democrats to rein in Israel's assault in Gaza.